So I like one of the last questions is, do you think that the growing focus on intersectionality will replace the focus on gender?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's always very interesting for me to listen to my recording because I always sound so calm and collected, and I'm not always calm and collected when I speak in person. So that's always like an out of the world experience for me. I'm really happy to be here. Now to answer your question, I think there is widespread sort of acknowledgement that gender is one of the main axes of what you would call marginalization and privilege. And I think what an intersectional approach is asking us to do is not to ignore gender equality or gender inequality, but to be sure to include other axes of marginalization that actually compound gender inequality. To not always think of women as a homogeneous group, that what indigenous women might experience will be different from what women of color will experience, or from what women who are in the low income categories will experience, but also that we don't just use this as an analytical category, but really go deeper to understand how does one's identity, how does women's identity and multiple identities actually shape their experiences of a policy, of a program, or an intervention, not to make the assumptions that because women are women, that they will experience inequalities in the same way, or that some women might actually experience some privilege that other women on the opposite side experience as marginalization. So I actually don't think this will replace this, at least for people who have a good understanding of what this actually means. There is always, of course, a potential risk, but I think what we call for is really an understanding that gender is one of the axes of inequality that actually affects the majority of people, or of privilege that affects the majority of people, and that is always, in most cases, going to be our starting point for work on equality.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. I had a question related to that, and that is, I wonder if you could go into, you speak to how you would consider different variables of intersectionality, different variables of marginalization when working with youth, for example.
So some of our work, and so I'll start actually from the basics, like even the audience that are here. When somebody says they have a youth program, like what comes to mind? Like when people talk about youth, what often comes to mind? In a lot of cases, and especially when governments say we have a youth program, like I see a lot of that in Kenya. Oh, we are empowering women, we are empowering youth through provision of motorcycles that they can use to earn money as they do transport program, as they do their government programs. And then you think, so we still have a lot of young women for who, and a lot of regions where riding motorcycles is almost not acceptable for young women. So what youth were they talking about? Were they talking about here? And so we have to think about youth in its totality first. So when we talk about youth, we're talking about young women and we're talking about young men. And some of our research is actually showing, even within groups of young women, if young women are married with children, especially very early in their or late in their adolescence and early in their adulthood, 17, 18, 19-year-olds, like their economic outlook is very different from young women who then have a couple of additional years of schooling and get married at 25, 26. So even within that category of young women, you can't just think of them as a group. You have to figure out what are the other issues, what are the other variables, what are the other identities of these young women that are likely to affect what happens, whether young women are married or not. So in a lot of, especially in Africa, a lot of young women, if they are unmarried, do not have right to their father's land. Yeah. And yet they do not also have as a husband who confers or who can confer them rights or ownership to land. So even just within the same age group, whether they are married or not married, has an implication in terms of can they participate in agricultural activities? Can they have access to land, whether through customary rights, etc. So these are all things that we have to take into account.
Great, thank you. We have several questions about the power with, power through, etc. So let me ask them separately. So could you explain more about the difference between intrinsic agency, the power within, and instrumental agency, the power to? And how could projects or policies focus on one but not the other?
So intrinsic agency, or the power within, has a lot to do with people's aspirations. What is it that women believe they can do? Sometimes because of processes of socialization, because of lack of voice as women are growing up as girls. They can grow to a point where they do not have confidence, they do not have voice, their aspirations have been confined by societal expectations. It's why we keep talking about, for example, women in STEM, because somebody somewhere, teachers, the social system, made girls believe that they're not good in science. And so it's not just enough to put them in a science class. You've got to focus on their own self-belief and aspirations. And that's sort of the power within, yeah, that believe that the women can and are able to do things. Now, the power to do, when we do a lot of skills building, capacity building, we focus a lot on the power to do, yeah? That power to do things, the skills to do things, the capacity to do things, the capacity to run a business. And the difference here is, if I can just give, actually that's a very good example of women running businesses. So it's one thing to get women to know how to do their books as a power to do, calculate their profits, fill in their forms to go to the bank and get a loan. It's a different thing for them to actually have that self-belief and that sexual actualization, that they can actually run businesses as individuals. Now, a lot of women already have this power within, and part of it is really this process to get that belief in themselves back, that has been shaped a lot by the way they are socialized. So I would say that's the big difference between what you call power within and power to do.
Right. Another question related. So what is the role of this new concept of power through in the Kabir conceptual framework of resources, agency, and outcomes regarding food production and women's empowerment? So a question about power through.
So power through is also, it goes along as well with what we call the power the power with, this idea of collective agency, that because women have seen other women succeed, they start believing that they can also do, all because you have women leaders are taking that opportunity to then support the empowerment of other women. So the power through comes a lot also from the concept of power, of power with.
Okay, we have a question from Noor Sadiq from Afghanistan, and it is regarding men and masculinity. So he'd like to ask if you think the focus should be on training or retraining men to support the efforts to eliminate inequalities.
That is a great contribution, Noor, because a huge part of gender transformative approaches is the engagement of men and boys to see gender equality as not just good for women, but also good for families, good for communities. And there's a lot of alliances right now, and I have seen there's a session on this after this keynote that actually focuses on the approaches for engaging men and boys for gender equality. But it's not just men and boys, it's also traditional leaders, religious leaders, because in a lot of cases, when we talk about changing norms, in most communities, you have who are called gatekeepers of traditions, gatekeepers of norms. Chiefs that believe land should only be owned through the relationship with men. And if you engage those kinds of leaders in terms of thinking through, actually, if women have more rights to land, productivity will increase, there'll be more investments in land itself, that women's own bargaining power is going to change, they can negotiate. This becomes very critical, because if you change one chief in a community, it beats trying to push women to organize women to push for their own change, which is still critical. But the engagement of men, boys, and gatekeepers is so crucial. But this also goes back to the point at which this needs to happen. And that's why I keep talking about men and boys, because some of this also needs to go into our education systems. How are boys being trained to view the role of the girls in their class, in their community? How can you start teaching at the early age the importance of women's voice, women's dignity, why women are human beings and have rights? And we've seen these engagement of men approaches actually working very, very well in terms of addressing gender-based violence. Countries like Burundi have alliances of men against gender-based violence. Other countries, like I used to do a lot of work in Mali, where the engagement of traditional leaders actually then leads to allocation of a certain percentage of traditional lands to women, because they start understanding why that is so critical. So yes, I do agree that a huge component of changing norms that cause inequality is the engagement of men.
Okay, thank you. Here's one of the recent questions. How has gender-based violence been addressed in gender transformative approaches in the setting of agricultural systems and agricultural development?
So I will say that within the agriculture and food systems work, a lot of the focus, there hasn't been a lot of focus on gender-based violence, not as much as, for example, health programming. has been. So a lot of it has been maybe in terms of monitoring and evaluation. We're gonna look at the potential negative impacts of a program by looking at whether it caused incidences or increased gender-based violence. But much more recently, we are seeing actually such a direct link between work on food systems, on agriculture, and gender-based violence that it's becoming part of programming, right? And it has also required um, those working in agriculture development programs to actually partner beyond agriculture. Yeah, partner more with civil society, partner more with alliances of men-based organizations. When I was in Kenya, we had a program in Burundi working with a group called the Batanga Mucho. That's a men-based alliance to end gender-based violence. But this was a livelihoods agricultural program where part of the conversations are around gender equality and gender-based violence, understanding that it has a huge implications on what happens in agriculture and food systems, understanding that when households are food insecure, the likelihood of violence actually increases. So it's really understanding conceptually also what are the linkages between these issues and making sure that we are programming for them.
Great. I have a kind of complex question. So the person says, it's exciting to see the evolution of the WIA, that's the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, for projects and different sectors. And these certainly collect more specific data for projects, but is there a gap with the theoretical definitions of empowerment, which are broader? Another way to put it is, do we know why changes in empowerment or decision-making seem limited to a specific product or sector and do not seem to create cross-sectoral change?
Yeah, that you are right. That's a complex question. But so one thing to say about the WIA is that what we see a lot is the quantitative index, but behind that quantitative index is a lot of qualitative work that goes on to understand how empowerment happens, people's own definitions of empowerment. When do women feel empowered? What does it mean for them to be empowered? And a lot of that qualitative research has actually informed the index. The second thing I'll say about that is there's a lot of new indicators and new questions that have got into the WIA, and especially when it's focused on the project level. So things like couple communication, which doesn't have to do anything, with anything in agriculture, but it's sort of a household type of relational measure. So while a lot of questions have to do with decisions on production, there's a lot of questions on decisions about expenditures. Who's making major household decisions on expenditures? Who's making major household decisions in terms of whether to access or not access credit? How are conflicts resolved in homes? Do women feel comfortable to then talk about things that they don't like? Can they tell their husbands? Can their husbands tell them? So there's also a lot of questions in the WIA that actually go beyond agriculture, because there's also needs to be a comprehensive measure of empowerment that doesn't just look at the sector. And that's why it's been easy to apply it. You can go in there and add questions on nutrition or add questions on livestock, but basically the main components of the WIA cover quite a broad spectrum of what empowerment and agency means.
Well, you've referred to it a little bit, but because this conference does focus on how-to and methods, and I want to just spotlight a little bit and ask you to address what should be the role of qualitative research in gender and development.
I think I have mentioned a bit of that in my last response, that I always say quantitative research tells us in a lot of ways what is, what is. Now, how it came to be, the processes that led to that change, a lot of that you get from qualitative research. So I always think of quantitative and qualitative research as twins. Is it twins? They are even more than twins, that one cannot really happen without the other, because if you just use quantitative methods, you sort of getting what is, how is it related to something else, how is it correlated to something else, to what extent is it likely to happen, but how it happened, what people think about it, what it means to people, all that comes comes from qualitative research. And for gender research specifically, it is so important to understand how can we measure the empowerment of people when we do not know what empowerment means for them? Do we even know the language they use to describe it? Yeah. Do we know when they feel empowered? What are those situations that get them to feel empowered? A lot of those insights are from qualitative research. And I'm a mixed methods researcher myself, so it's always very interesting when I think about this, because you actually get a much fuller picture. You get how social change happens from actually using quantitative research to tell you has change happened, and using qualitative research to say change for who and how, and what does it mean? What does it mean for people?
Great, thank you so much. So mixed methods and more than twins. Okay.
I don't even know what to call it. Maybe somebody else out there has a better word for it.
Right. Okay, so we have a question from Maggie Hartman, who's one of our undergraduates supporting the conference, and she asks, how can gender transformative efforts within the formal realm of policy and programming directly impact gender power dynamics in the informal social norm realm?
Okay, ask that again.
How can gender transformative efforts within the formal realm of policy and programming directly impact gender power dynamics in the informal social norm realm?
Okay, so I'm actually gonna use it's also a complex question, but I'm gonna use an example to illustrate it. So around 2010, in 2010, in Kenya we got a new constitution, right? And this new constitution said that we, men and women, boys and girls, have equal rights to inherit land, right? It's in the constitution. It is a law, yeah? But then what happened is, I actually remember so well, because then in 2013, my dad, who's a special kind of person, decided he was going to give all his children land. We are 6 girls and 2 boys. And so he called us all, and we all went to the land office to get this land. He said, I am not a constitution law breaker. I'm going to give land to all my children. So we get to this land board, and the land board is a group of people sitting around a table, and we have to sign these documents. And they ask my dad 2 or 3 times, are you sure you want to give them land? They don't even want to say the girls. Are you sure you want to give them land? And he says, yes, I want to give them land. And they ask the second time, even the married ones. And he says, even the married ones. Even this particular plot, so there's a plot of land that he was giving me that's very commercial, high value, even this particular one. And he says, yes, even this particular one. Because what had happened? The law had changed, but the belief system hadn't changed. And the law, when the law changes, we also need a lot of awareness and socialization so that the belief system also changes. So sometimes the law, this change in the formal system, can be a trigger to get people thinking the social norms need to change as well to go with the law. I don't know whether without the law that my father would have decided I'm going to give land to the girls. I don't know. I actually I should ask that question now that I'm verbalizing it. But so it is important that there's a guiding law, because the law can be a trigger for a belief system to change. But I'm also saying that just a change in law does not guarantee that there will be a change in the belief system. And we still have to work. We still have to work on that in a lot of ways.
Excellent. Well, we are getting so many questions. I'm afraid we're not going to get to them all. So here's another one. This is back to intersectionality, but a very particular focus. So when discussing intersectionality, researchers often pay lip service to inclusion for queer and transgender individuals, but we rarely include these axes of discrimination in our research, especially in the settings where these individuals are most vulnerable. Yeah. What is our responsibility to these and other vulnerable populations, and how can we be more inclusive with respect to sexuality and transgender individuals?
I think from a perspective of intersectionality, we have to. I don't think we have a way out of this. In the same way we think about multiple identities when we think about race, is the same way we have to think about multiple identities with respect to sexual identity. I don't think we have a way out. Now, in a lot of countries, and especially for researchers, that has been a sensitive topic, because there's a lot of researchers who are working, especially in countries where LGBTQ is not recognized as an identity group, where it is actually illegal. And we know a couple of those countries, and this has put a lot of researchers at I don't know what to call it, and especially for countries in Africa. But it is something that we cannot get away from, because it is an axis of marginalization that has actually even put people's lives at risk in some of our countries, where it has it has stopped LGBTQ groups from getting access to essential services. And usually my advice to a lot of the researchers working on these issues is to also partner with organizations that understand sexual identities and how to deal with them, because it's not everybody that has this. It's the same as youth programming. If you're working in agriculture and food systems and you're working with young people, you need to be partnering with people that have a good understanding of sexual and reproductive rights. As some of our research has shown, that if you're just working on economic activities with young women without thinking about sexual and reproductive health and rights, the likelihood that you're gonna get to empowering these young people or making sure they exercise their agency is gonna be very, very difficult. And this is where partnerships are so critical. And one of the things we've really enjoyed at IFPRI is to have these different groups groups of people. Although we are the Food Policy Research Institute, that we have colleagues that are working on issues of health. We have colleagues that are working on issues of sexual and health, reproductive rights, on colleagues working on social protection. But there's a whole universe of potential partners here if we actually want our work to have impact, to make sure we are identifying what these axes of marginalization are, what these compounding marginalizations are, and that we are actually designing to be inclusive of different groups, and not just inclusive in they were participating, but in actually designing interventions that address those marginalizations.
Okay, I'm so sorry that we are running out of time, and I'm going to ask what might be the last question. It's just a very different kind of question. So in your presentation, you mentioned the need for more research into the role of information in mass media. How do you think the gender digital divide and women's restricted access to information and communications technologies affects gender transformative programming, and how might ICT be leveraged?
So we know there's a powerful role for media, a powerful role for digital technologies, and there's a lot of movement towards this, whether people are talking about access to extension services, access to sexual reproductive health services. So there's a lot of conversations about that, but a lot of programming that's going towards that. But we must be conscious that we still have a technology gap. Over the last few years, we've seen a huge proportionate increase in ownership of mobile phones, etc., for women, but we still have a gender gap that's worrying. And therefore, we must be conscious that digital technologies are powerful, but they also have potential to leave women out. And so even when we know we are using digital tools, we need to be careful that we are combining the use of digital tools. So first is the closing of the gap, but also to be conscious that digital tools can sometimes leave out the people who need the services or the programs that we have most. And therefore, we have to have a combination of approaches. If you're extending sexual reproductive health services through phones, make sure you are also doing it through local radio that communities might have access to as groups, etc. That you are also having community level meetings, so that we are making sure that we're not widening these gaps. Because if there's already a technology gap, then you add on to the technology gap an information gap, and then you add on to the information gap an implementation or service gap. What we then end up is widening this gap rather than closing it. So I would say two things. We've got to close those gaps, but in the meantime, we need to be designing programs in ways that recognize these multiple access to information, so that we are not leaving people behind.
I'm afraid I hate to ask this question, but I wonder if you could give a 1-minute response, okay, just to address this different issue. What role do you see for the private sector in gender transformative work, and what successful approaches have you seen applied in the agricultural space?
Okay. So there, especially within food systems, because of the presence of private sector, there's actually a huge role for private sector in terms of gender transformative approaches. One of the, I spent a couple of years, for example, working on what we call gender transformative financial inclusion, because for a long time we've thought the issue of the access to finance gap is we fix women. We train them on how to keep their books. We train them on, I don't know, to get confidence to walk into the bank. But we forgot to fix the system itself, the financial institutions. How do they design for women? women? How do they deliver products in ways that reach women? And that means that you have to work with financial institutions themselves. And I remember a couple of years ago, I had a program with the National Microfinance Bank in Tanzania, with TI Go, the mobile banking. And what we were doing is actually making sure that we were even integrating gender messages. I mean, your bank keeps sending you statements and how much loan you've got left, but how can we put some of the transformative gender messaging into that? How can we make sure that we're getting feedback from women in terms of the kinds of products we want, and how can banks then use that feedback to design products that actually work for women and to deliver them in ways that work for women?
Okay, thank you. And I'm sorry to put you in the position to answer in a second. I'm going to turn it over to Erin. And thank you so much for addressing many of the questions that came through.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everyone, for the excellent questions. Lovely discussion.